So with that, I know that we have a lot of presenters and speakers today. And I'm very personally interested in hearing some of our speakers talk. So I'll begin by introducing Dr. Justin Fisher, waxing philosophically.
Great. I'm going to be talking about some arguments that several philosophers have given for thinking that lots and lots of people are actually atheists, closet atheists who don't come out and perhaps don't even realize that they are atheists, but if you watch carefully the attitudes that they take towards religion and the ways that they behave, there's actually good evidence for thinking that lots and lots of people in our population actually are atheists. So two people have given these sorts of arguments. One is George Ray. He calls the view meta-atheism. And so here's a quote from him. He says that despite appearances, I'm just going to paraphrase because I can't see the computer, but despite appearances, many people who have a sort of Western educational background, who are aware of evolutionary theory and things like that, they actually don't believe in God. At least at some level, they don't believe in God. Even if they say they do, they're self-deceived about what their beliefs actually are. Another person who's advocated this sort of view is Daniel Dennett. He says that more people believe in belief that it's a good idea to believe in God than actually believe in God. So today I'm going to be talking about some of the arguments that they give for this position, which we'll just use the word meta-atheism for it. It's worth distinguishing three sorts of closet atheists. So first, what is it to be an atheist? Well, that's just to believe, at least deep down, that God doesn't exist. What is it to be in the closet? Well, that's not to be open with other people about having this belief. But you could distinguish different sorts of closet atheists in terms of, well, what do they think their own beliefs are? So you could have somebody who knows full well that they don't believe in God, and yet isn't open about that. So this could either be lack of openness or outright insincerity. Second sort of person might realize that they have deep doubts about whether or not God exists, so they think of themselves as an agnostic, but they keep the doubts hidden. And a third sort is a sort of person who's in a sort of self-deception, where they think that they actually are a theist, but if you attend carefully to the ways that they behave and the attitudes they take, that belies the fact that they actually aren't really a theist after all. And Ray thinks, he's not accusing lots of theists of insincerity. Probably there are some who know full well that they aren't theists and yet continue going through the motions anyway. But Ray's argument is more that lots of people who think they're theists actually are self-deceived. Okay. So one thing, I actually have the slide in here for when I teach this stuff because I have lots of students who are theists, and you guys probably don't need this, but it's worth noting that meta-atheism is compatible with theism. It could be that God actually exists, but most people don't believe in him. And in fact, there are lots of theists who have held something like meta-atheism anyway, theists who think that faith is very, very difficult to do, and theists who think that the world's fallen into decay, and all those other people, especially in other denominations, they are only paying lip service. They don't actually believe in God. So meta-atheism might be a friendly view to lots of theists, but it's also, I guess it tends to be advocated, at least in the philosophy literature, by people who think atheism is true. Good. So now I'll talk about, Ray gives about 11 different independent arguments, but I'm going to sort of clump these together into three main categories of arguments that people give for accepting meta-atheism. So one category is that there seems to be theoretical reasons why you would expect people both to be atheists and to remain in the closet about their atheism. Second sort of category is if you attend to the attitudes that people take towards religious claims, their attitudes suggest that they don't actually believe that these claims are true. They treat these claims more like they treat fictional stories than the way that they would treat actual matters of fact. And the third sort of category is that if you look at people's behavior, they behave as though they don't actually believe that God exists and that the sorts of stories that are told in church are actually true. Okay, so I'll go through these one at a time. So first, these sort of theoretical reasons. this is probably the least friendly to theists part of meta-atheism, is Ray's sort of argument is, well, the arguments for God's existence have obvious problems, and probably many of you are sort of convinced of that. Ray spends some time going through those, but I won't bore you here with the sorts of obvious problems that there are with arguments for God's existence. In contrast, Ray thinks that arguments against God's existence don't have obvious problems. So one of the strongest arguments against God's existence is the problem of evil. Look at all the suffering that happens in the world. If there really were a benevolent, powerful, all-knowing God out there, would he really allow all this suffering to happen? If you look at the world, it doesn't look like we have a powerful, invisible friend looking out for us. And so if just taking the weight of the evidence seems to weigh definitely in the direction of being an atheist. I'll say that I'm not actually sure here where Ray might be sort of overestimating the capacity of Westerners who've been exposed to evolutionary theory to judge that evolutionary theory actually does do a better job at explaining the features we observe in species. I think there might be lots of Americans who aren't clever enough to make this sort of argument, but Ray at least thinks that the obvious preponderance of the evidence is in favor of atheism, so that's a theoretical reason to expect that most people would be able to see this, and they're therefore atheists. But Ray thinks there's also lots of reasons why people who are atheists would have incentives, sort of practical reasons, to hide their atheism. And so here's a cartoon by somebody who obviously isn't an atheist saying, well, here are the rewards of being an atheist, and it's a pretty empty box. And many of us realize that there are many more rewards to being an atheist. We have fun pud mites, among other things. But probably understandably, many people who are theists or think they're theists aren't aware of all the rewards of being an atheist, and so the cartoon probably is a more accurate depiction of what they think life as an atheist would be like. And so we can sort of list what a lot of these incentives would be, things like Pascal's wager, worrying that if I come out as an atheist, does that increase the risk that I might end up being wrong and going to hell? Will friends and family and church members ostracize me after I come out? Will I lose the sort of sense of meaningfulness that my life has? So there's lots of sort of practical incentives that even if you think that atheism is true, that you might want to hide it and not come out about your atheism. And so Ray takes that to be reason to think that even if most people are atheists, you'd expect them to remain in the closet about it. And furthermore, given all the evidence we have about the role that self-deception, delusion play in our psychology, that we often sort of take beliefs that we aren't ready to accept and sort of submerge them and refuse to acknowledge their existence, that gives us reason to believe that people might be in self-denial about their atheism and not even be aware of the fact that they are atheists. So that's the sort of theoretical argument that Ray gives for thinking that most people probably would be closet atheists. You might wonder, well, that's a nice theoretical argument, but where's the evidence that this is actually true? So let's go on to the second sort of argument that people like Ray and Dennett give. So this is an argument that looks at the sorts of attitudes that people take towards religious claims. And so here we'll go through some observations of the attitudes that people take and think, well, do these observations fit better with the idea that people take religious claims to be matter-of-fact claims, or do they instead weigh in favor of thinking that people take religious claims to be matters of fiction? And so one observation is the role that authoritative texts play in religion. And you can think about, well, take matters of fact, probably a great example of a quite authoritative historical text involving a matter-of-fact claim, which is not coming up, is Newton's Principia, where he basically outlined the tenets of Newtonian physics, which is basically the tenets that you would need and were used to, say, navigate rocket ships to the moon. So as far as any sort of empirical test is concerned, Newton's Principia has way outperformed the Bible. But do scientists take this as authoritative? Do we teach this as doctrine in our schools? No, there's a... there's a mountain of other texts that we use instead. There are newer physics texts, and we're happy to fix the things that Newton got wrong. So in the case of physics, we don't just take one historical text as authoritative. We're happy to fill in our knowledge more and update our textbooks and stuff like that. So that's the way people typically treat matter-of-fact claims. Now contrast this against how people treat fiction. take the claim that Conan Doyle wrote that Sherlock Holmes smoked a pipe. It's not like further evidence is going to come in and make us change our minds and say, oh, well, maybe Holmes didn't smoke a pipe after all. No. Conan Doyle wrote that Holmes smoked a pipe, so he smoked a pipe. There's no need to add further text to this to figure this matter out. If you want to know the matter of fact about this stuff, you just go back and read the original source. And so that's evidence that, well, the attitude people are taking towards religious claims is like the attitude that we take towards fiction rather than the attitude that we take towards matters of fact. Here's a second observation, the sort of attitude that people take towards the sort of mass killing and genocide that's present in religious texts. So I'll tell you a little story. I once was dating a Jewish woman, and her family invited me to come over for Passover dinner. And I don't know if you all know what Jewish ceremonies are like, but at Passover they sit and read the story of Passover, and it's actually a very disturbing story where part of the story is that the Jewish people living in Egypt marked their doors with goat blood so that basically when God came around killing all the babies, he would pass over their houses and not kill the firstborn babies in the houses that were marked, and would instead only kill the firstborn babies of all the Egyptian households. If you think about this as mass child murder, it's really disturbing. I wasn't willing to read this story. I was willing to sit there and watch them as a sort of participant anthropologist, but reading the story was too far for me to go, and it was a cause for tension, but it worked out in the end. They sort of realized that, this is a bit disturbing once I drew attention to it. But it's not just Passover. There are lots, probably the most extreme example is the flood, when God got really pissed off at all of humanity and basically killed everybody but about 16 people. That's genocide on a tremendously massive scale. Now, normally when we hear about people who want to achieve various political ends and go about it by killing a bunch of people, especially choosing people of a particular nationality or race or creed to kill, we're really, really disturbed by this. We think this is an awful thing. Surely they should have been able to find some other way to achieve their political ends, and especially if they were an all-powerful being who, they're omnipotent. They could do anything. You have to be concerned that this would be the route that they would choose. So if you're treating this as a matter of fact, it would need to be very disturbing. On the other hand, if you take fictional stories, Rambo goes around killing a lot of people, we don't really get concerned. Well, did that person really need to die? Is there some other option, Rambo? We're just happy to enjoy the story. And so, again, if you're thinking about this as a matter of fact, people would need to be really disturbed about these stories, but in fact they aren't. They enjoy the stories in much the same way that they enjoy violent movies. And so here again is evidence that people are taking this not to be a matter of historical fact, what God actually did. Instead, they're just taking it to be a story. Good. Here's another sort of thing having to do with attitudes. This cartoon, I'll zoom in on it so we can read it, and then I'll tell you the sort of point to be drawn from it. So the cartoon involves MartyrCon, and at MartyrCon, Jesus introduced himself. He says, "Hello, I'm Jesus. You may have heard of me. I got nailed to a frickin' cross for mankind's sins." This guy responds, "That's a cute story. Sounds like a rough weekend." And Jesus says, "Who the hell is this guy?" And he's told, "Well, that's Prometheus, the guy who gave the secret of fire to mortals." And that this is hard to do because I can't see it. Maybe this will work. Good. And doing that really pissed off Zeus. So Zeus shackled Prometheus to the side of a cliff. Each day an eagle would swoop down, rip him open, and devour his liver. Every night Zeus would heal him so it could happen again the next day. And this went on for centuries. Jesus says, "Damn." And then Prometheus says, "Yeah, but I bet those little nails in your hands were really ouchy before your ascension to heaven a day and a half later." Oh, snap. So it's sort of a funny cartoon, thinking about, well, just how bad was the suffering that Jesus endured. Now, if you accept the sort of biblical story that Christ's suffering somehow atoned for the sins of all mankind through all of history, well, one question is, well, how could one person's suffering atone for somebody else's wrongdoing? That's not the sort of justice system that most people in their ordinary lives believe in. But beyond that, Ray points out, if you took this to be matter of fact, you'd also need to be concerned, well, really, was this enough suffering? Was a day and a half of suffering? If he was really going to atone for the Holocaust, wouldn't he need to suffer more like Prometheus did, and not just for a day and a half on the cross, knowing full well what you're looking forward to because you're omniscient. So it seems like if you're treating this as matter-of-fact sort of claims, you'd need to ask a lot more questions than people typically do about this. And so this is further evidence that people are taking this just to be a sort of interesting story rather than a matter of fact. Further thing on this claim is the sort of mysteries of religion and the sort of holding up faith as a virtue. So the Trinity, for example, thinking of three things as both being three separate things and one thing at the same time. And this is supposed to be a great mystery. Well, regarding matters of fact, we take if something's mysterious and hard to understand and seems to be impossible as reason to reject a view. But in religion, this is held up as reasons to sort of accept the view. And it's worth noting that in fiction, we're that way. In The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, Douglas Adams points out repeatedly in the story that, of course, this is impossible, but it's still an interesting story, and it's fun to talk about all this sort of time travel that's involved in The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. We kind of enjoy these sorts of mysteries and are willing to take them on board as part of the willful suspension of disbelief involved in fiction. It's also worth pointing out that this sort of idea of taking things on faith and not exploring into things, Ray points out, well, this is one of the key tricks that con men use, is if people are starting to sniff out the con, you act personally offended that people don't trust you, don't have faith in you, and that sort of deters this sort of thing. And this is a sort of mechanism that if you suspect your spouse is cheating, but you're in denial about it, you're going to avoid asking questions about this. So this seems like exactly the sort of pattern you would expect from people who didn't actually take these to be matters of fact and instead were in a sort of self-denial about it. Good. Okay, so that wraps up the second class of arguments, looking at people's attitudes towards religion. The third class we'll talk about is looking at people's behavior. Now, you might think people's behavior suggests that they're pretty religious, at least in America. So the percentage of Americans who say they tithe each year, give a tenth of their income to the church, is 17%, which is, pretty good number of people. Percent who, if you ask them, did you attend church in the last week, different polls give slightly different results, but they're all in the ballpark of 40% of Americans say they attended church in the last week. But on the other hand, if you actually look at financial records, the percent of people who actually do tithe, anybody guess? Somebody said 3%, so somebody knew the actual, or 3 is a popular number. So there's a big, 6-to-1 difference. 5 out of 6 people who claim they tithe are lying to you. They don't actually do it. About people who say they attended church in the last week, if you give people a sort of time diary where they record where they are each hour of the day, or you say, we're interested in whether you would be exposed to particular chemicals, where were you on Sunday morning? What percentage of people do you think say they were in church? 12, 15, you're hearing different numbers here. It's actually 20%, which is a little higher than you're guessing, but still it's a lot less than 40%. Out of every 2 people who say they went to church this week, one of them's lying about this. And it's interesting that the actual church attendance rates are in line with Northern Europeans who are sort of notoriously a-religious. That the main difference between Americans and Europeans isn't that we go to church a lot more. It's that we lie and say we go to church a lot more than we actually do. So it seems like when you actually look at people's behavior, it's showing this sort of pattern of self-deception and other deception about our religiosity. Good. And the churches may realize this. Here's a sign from a church that says, staying in bed shouting, "Oh God," does not constitute going to church. Okay, so here's another sort of observation of behavior. This was pointed out 150 years ago by the philosopher John Stuart Mill. He says, well, all Christians believe that Christ's teachings are that they should sell all that they have and give it to the poor. A rich man comes up and asks Jesus what he can do to get into heaven, and Jesus basically suggests this, and the rich guy's like, well, do I really have to do that? And Jesus says, well, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter into the kingdom of God. So it's pretty obvious what the message of this is, and yet Mill points out if you watch Christians' behavior, they don't live by these sorts of tenets. How many Americans are actually giving away all their money? How many Americans are pursuing wealth as hard as they can? You have a pretty good sense of what their behavior shows, what their beliefs actually are about these matters, and it's not what Christ's teachings were. And Mill also points out that if you try to point this out to people, you become very unpopular quickly. Another sort of evidence in this ballpark is thinking about people's attitudes towards death. If you thought that heaven actually existed and you have a loved one who's suffering from an illness, then they're being able to go on to heaven where they're going to be happy and not suffering anymore, and pretty soon you get to join them. That should be a matter for joy. You know, that's great that my loved one isn't suffering anymore. Yeah, it's a little bad that I don't get to see him for a little while, but I'll join him pretty soon. By and large, death should be not the sort of terrible grieving experience that, in fact, for most people who claim to believe death really is. People behave as though they think their loved ones are gone forever, not as though they believe their loved ones have gone on to heaven. Last sort of thing in this category is thinking about matters of punishment. This is something that the New Testament is pretty clear upon also, that when some people do wrong, you're supposed to turn the other cheek, judge not lest ye be judged. And yet, if you look at the way that people who claim to be theists respond when the evildoers come and do stuff, it's bomb the shit out of them. It's not, wait and God will sort things out later on because he knows better than we do. And so again, it seems like people are acting as though they don't actually believe that God is going to be the arbiter of these things. Instead, they act as though we're on our own. Good. Okay, so that's the three sorts of arguments. All of these give us some reason to think that a lot of people who claim to be theists, who go to church somewhat regularly, maybe are actually more on our team than we kind of thought they were originally, which is interesting thoughts. And the later talks in the presentation today are going to address issues like, well, what sort of rhetorical strategies should we use with people like this, and better understanding this sort of situation. And the next thing we're going to do to sort of, this is a video that really struck me when I listened to it. I guess it was written as a love song of a woman for a man, but if you go through, and I couldn't do it has subtitles, but I didn't know how to go through and capitalize all the H's, but if you view it as a sort of unrequited love song for God, it gives you a very interesting window on this sort of self-deception and conflictedness that Ray's sort of meta-atheist would have. So I'll go ahead and play this video, and I invite you to capitalize all the he's and hims in the video as we play it.